Hi, everyone. This is Channing Dutton, and you have now joined us in the Three Degree podcast. Be sure to watch the show on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. We go live on YouTube, so that's going to be available immediately. You may have to flip to the live channel to see this exact segment. But today, we're going to be talking about what's really in the news all the time. The last 3 nights on NBC Nightly News, the first 4 minutes has been about climate chaos, fires, flooding, precipitation events, not only here in the US, but all over the planet. And today we have a guest who's going to help us tie into what you're going to be seeing on TV in the next 72 hours. I'll flip it to Chris.
Yeah, it's pretty big because it's the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And it's funny, I met our guest today over a beer. One of my professors from Plymouth State University in meteorology was Sam Miller. And everyone that's listening knows my story about my departure from Iowa. Well, I was chief meteorologist there. And Sam said, well, the state climatologist of Louisiana, the former state climatologist of Louisiana, and you have a lot in common. So why don't we grab a beer while you were down for the AMS conference, the American Meteorological Society conference in New Orleans. We hit it off. He was great when we were strategizing ideas, and I do some freelancing for the Boston Globe. I thought of talking to Barry, and then after that conversation, I called Channing and said, we need to have Barry Keim on our podcast. So we're going to introduce Barry now. Barry, thanks for joining us. I'm going to toss it to David with the first question, but I'm really excited to hear what your thoughts are 20 years later after Hurricane Katrina.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sure to disappoint, but we'll see how it goes.
I don't think so. Barry, we were talking just before you came on, before the show, what we remembered about where we were. And it seems like Hurricane Katrina was, where we were at that moment in time, because we all remember it. I certainly remember it like it was yesterday. And as a non-scientist, I was just beginning to understand a little bit from my studies that we could start attributing some of these extreme events to our changing climate. And you were at the forefront of that. And I was just wondering if you could tell us, set us up with what was going on 20 years ago and what you were seeing as that storm was developing and what you were kind of thinking and going through your head about what was going to happen.
Okay, yeah, I'll tell you a little. I'll start this from the perspective of the storm. So the storm spins up over the Bahamas, and it becomes a Category 1 hurricane, and it starts crossing the Florida Peninsula, pretty far south. And it took a very slow path across Florida. As a Category 1, it did more damage than you might anticipate because it was moving so slow and the exposure was so long. But then the storm, once it crossed over Florida and got back into the Gulf of Mexico, it got out over what we call the loop current. And a loop current is this big tongue of extraordinarily warm water that comes up from the Caribbean. It's it's very warm through great depths of the ocean. And so there's a lot of energy stored there. And when that hurricane got out over that loop current, it exploded in intensity, went from a Category 1, with wind speeds in the 70s or 80s, and went all the way up to 175 mile an hour winds out over the Gulf. And it started, and initially we were thinking that this was going to probably hit the panhandle of Florida. In fact, as recently, if we think about the storm made landfall very early in the morning on Monday morning, August 29th. Well, the previous Friday morning, so 3 days earlier, the models or the Hurricane Center had the storm hitting the panhandle of Florida. That was at the 11 a.m. Advisory. By the 11 p.m. advisory, 12 hours later, late Friday night, they finally they kept bumping the storm, down the coast towards the west, towards New Orleans. And by 11 o'clock that night on Friday, they had the thing coming right over southeastern Louisiana. And that ended up being the correct forecast. The 48-hour, that was probably a little over 48 hours before landfall. And it was a very good forecast over that duration because they put it there and it stayed there. And so as the storm is churning through the Gulf, again, it blows up into this giant Category 5 storm. It was a rather large storm in its spatial dimensions, but obviously Category 5 is pretty scary. It builds up this enormous Category 5 storm surge along with it. And then as it got closer to the coast, it got over cooler water closer to the coast, got out from underneath one of those eddies from the loop current and started to weaken, but it made landfall as I don't want to make this thing sound like a weakling. It was a Category 3. It was still a major hurricane when it made landfall in Buras, Louisiana, but it was packing a Category 5 storm surge with it. Okay. It already built that surge up, and that momentum didn't back down as the storm weakened a little bit before landfall. And that's what slammed into Mississippi. They had a 28-foot storm surge, and that is the highest, the largest magnitude surge that we have on record in the Gulf of Mexico. And the previous high was from Hurricane Camille in 1969, and that had a 24-foot storm surge. So just give you some idea. And not coincidentally, it's at exactly the same spot, right by Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, is where that largest storm surge had occurred. Now, while all this was going on, I was at what's called the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. It's a mouthful. The acronym is GOSEP. So I was down at GOSEP at the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and giving briefings to all the constituents, at the center where all the decision making was taking place on how to cope with the storm, what to evacuate, and all this kind of stuff. So one of the amazing things about the storm, by the way, is we in southeastern Louisiana, in this case, we really didn't, wrap our head around the fact we wouldn't get hit by a hurricane until very late Friday night. And a lot of people didn't get that information until Saturday morning. Now, keep in mind, the storm hit on Monday morning, or made landfall on Monday morning. It was really, things were breaking down on Sunday, okay, as the storm was approaching. So we really just had 2 days to get people out of harm's way. The Louisiana Department of Transportation, I give them kudos. They did a remarkable job getting over 1 million people out of harm's way for that storm. Now, there were a lot of shortcomings in the evacuation. They left a lot of people behind in New Orleans. We saw what that aftermath looked like. It was very ugly. But to still get over 1 million people out of New Orleans in that short a period of time, phenomenal. They did a great job. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you guys. And I'm sure you have more questions to ask.
And I love this. When I asked you, Barry, yesterday, when you're helping me with a story for the Boston Globe, I said, when you look at the attribution of the impacts of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, what percent was a natural disaster versus what percent was man-made? And I guess, with climate change, you could factor that in. But I mean, when it comes to the disaster that truly unfolded in New Orleans, what would you break down that percentage?
Okay, so if we're going to look at this only from the perspective of New Orleans and the metropolitan area, I would say it is 98% man-made and 2% natural. Bottom line was this was it was an engineering catastrophe, is what it was. It was levee failures that caused all the problems here in the metropolitan area. Had those levees not failed, it would have been minor flooding across the city. There was some wind damage, absolutely. We were on the weaker side of the hurricane, so the wind damage wasn't catastrophic. You saw what the roof of the Superdome looked like. I don't know, at least I think you have. The roof of the Superdome basically peeled off, and we had wind damage. There's no doubt about it. But the flood, the breaches in the levees is what really caused the major catastrophe across this area. And that was just an engineering problem. Now, Mississippi, that's a whole nother argument. That's why they had the 28-foot storm surge. They don't really have levees like we have them here in, protecting these large urban centers like we have in New Orleans. So a lot of the problems that happened in Mississippi still would have happened. But in New Orleans, had those levees held, it would not have been that big, nearly the deal that it was. So I would put it at about 98 and 2.
Barry, my most universal comment with guest after guest after guest is every comment from the guest triggers 6 different questions and 6 different directions that I would like to go. But here on 3 Degrees, we are preparing and presenting this podcast with a look towards the future. We don't really, revisiting what happened with Katrina is important because there's so many lessons, starting with the preparedness and certainly with the engineering, steps that had contributed to what happened. But I'd like to have you talk about if we could place Katrina into the Gulf today in 2025, because we've had all these years of warming. We've had all these years of increased potential. We've seen this concept of rapid intensification. What do you think we would be looking at generally in terms of the 2025 version of Katrina? Blows into the Gulf as a Cat 5, maybe reduces to a Cat 3, as it makes landfall. What will our future audience see?
Well, for starters, forecasting has come a long way since 2005, since Katrina. The models have gotten so much more sophisticated. We can ingest so much more data. Computing has just gone through the roof. We can process so much more information. The modeling of the storms has gotten way more sophisticated. We can model the internal structures of the storms, and we can do things that we never could do before. So the forecasting would be a whole lot better. To give you an example, the average 5-day error on a forecast in 2005 was about 300 miles. So 5 days before landfall, when they predicted where that storm would make landfall, on average, it would be off by 300 miles. Well, today, that's been shrunk down to about 150. So we cut that in half. Over 2 days, the error was about 120 miles, whereas now it's down to about 60. So we cut that in half. So that's what informs the cone of uncertainty. So when you look at the cone of uncertainty, that is basically an artifact of what the average error is in the more recent years of forecasting hurricanes, the tracks. So for starters, we would do a much better job forecasting the storm, and that cone of error, the cone of uncertainty, would be a lot narrower, a lot more precision, and we'd know a lot better where that storm was going. So the hope is that we would get a lot more hours of warning, if you will, before the storm is going to hit a certain area. That's the first thing. Second thing is, since Hurricane Katrina hit this area, it exposed every single weak link in our chain here in our defense to storm surges. Everything was exposed. So now we know where all those problems are. So the beauty of that is that had Hurricane Katrina never occurred, we would still be sitting ducks like we were then, living in ignorance, or ignorant bliss, maybe is the best way of putting it, that nothing like this is ever really going to happen here, even though there's been chatter about it for decades. But nobody really believed that it was ever going to happen or was ever going to live to see it. Well, it just so happens we did live to see it. And like I said, everything was exposed, but now everything is fixed. And they've rethought out, kind of re-engineered how they protect the city. And one of the main things is in New Orleans, they have, it's just a bowl-shaped city. Okay, we have levees all around it, and a lot of the interior of New Orleans is below sea level, and some of it's between 5 and 10 feet below sea level. So to get the water out of here when it rains, they dump it into an outfall canal, and these outfall canals penetrate deep into the middle of the city, and then they're gravity fed out into Lake Pontchartrain to remove the water from the city. Well, during the Hurricane Katrina, water got pushed up those outfall canals, and that's where a lot of the breaches occurred that flooded the inner core of New Orleans, where the French Quarter is, for example. And so now they have gates at the heads of those outfall canals, so that Lake Pontchartrain now can no longer be pushed through those canals. And as a result, those canals will stay at some reasonable level, and we just have to protect ourselves along the shores of Lake Pontchartrain and not worry about all that extra levee along those canals. So it's a lot less levee to maintain. It's a lot less levee to bolster and make it stronger, for the next storm. So I would argue that we are in much, much better shape going forward. Now that doesn't mean it's infallible by any stretch. I mean, and also keep in mind, there's another thing. If Katrina happened exactly as it happened in 2005 and it happened today, again, I think it would only be minor flooding across New Orleans. But if the storm took a different path, I think things could be very different. Where that 28-foot storm surge hit Mississippi, if we shove the storm, westward by 30, 40 miles, it could be a whole different animal for New Orleans. And what that would look like, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm sure some of the modelers have modeled that to take a look at it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Barry. I want to go back 3 decades or so, and you were a young thinker about climate science and how it might be attributed to intensifying storms and maybe natural disasters in the future. What was it that got you interested so long ago in kind of looking at climate and how a change in climate and how it might influence storms and natural disasters in the future?
Well, I grew up in the suburbs of New Orleans, and we're a pretty wet place. We get a lot of heavy rainfalls, some induced by tropical systems, but many of them produced by fronts. Strong frontal boundaries will come through here. They will park, and we'll get torrential rains out of it just because there's so much moisture in the air down here, being so close to the Gulf of Mexico. All that moisture evaporating off that warm ocean surface, and it doesn't have to go very far to park itself over New Orleans. And then that can start interacting with air coming from northern Canada or even Siberia. And when those two air masses clash, basically what happens is the cold air burrows underneath the warm air. The cold air stays at the surface because it's more dense, and then that warmer moist air from the Gulf rides up and over it. And when that air is forced to rise, that's what triggers all the clouds and rainfall. And this is a point where you can, get some pretty heavy rainfalls. So growing up, I was always intrigued by these massive floods that we would have around here. And then we just started having a lot of them starting in the late 70s. I was just, in high school at the time, but I noticed. And so when I got to graduate school, it was kind of, we started having more and more of these. And by the time I hit graduate school, it was like, wow, is New Orleans getting more of these heavy rainfall events? So that's what I kind of cut my teeth looking at heavy rainfall here in my home city, and then eventually across the whole southeastern United States. And we've been looking at rainfall ever since. But then once Katrina hit, I got a heavy interest in hurricanes and, just looking at climate change in general. So that's kind of my evolution on how I got to be where I am. But it started with a real curiosity with those big rainfall events across New Orleans.
Barry, if you look at when we were down in New Orleans for the AMS conference, I every time I'm down in New Orleans, I try to go out of the French Quarter and head into the lower ninth and just see how the recovery is going. And I took these pictures just this past January, and there's still vacant lots, overgrown lots, homes that still have the X from the search and rescue painted on them that are vacant. Look, and I don't think that it's good that in areas urbanized and turned into, the top stores, beautiful housing. I think it should be represented what that community was before the storm, but really never got that opportunity, it doesn't seem like. And how concerned are you at what's happening now? So before going into Katrina, the Bush administration slashed FEMA significantly. And now we're seeing the same be done to NOAA. With a future event, how concerned are you by these cuts? And especially when you look at areas that need help the most, that really didn't get the help then, probably won't get the help now. What fears do you have for the rest of hurricane season and for the foreseeable future?
Nothing controversial here, right?
Yeah.
But I kid. No, I mean, I have some grave concerns. I mean, granted, FEMA, the way things played out with Katrina, and with the inadequate response, if you will, down here, it was just very slow. It just seems like everybody was flat-footed and underprepared. And I'm not just pointing the finger at FEMA. There were failures at all levels of government, and there were failures, on behalf of the city. I mean, there were failures everywhere. I mean, nobody was prepared for this. We were all caught flat-footed. I don't think the answer, however, is to eliminate FEMA. I mean, FEMA plays a very important role in the recovery of an area, and I do have some very serious concerns there. And then in terms of the meteorological and climatological world, I also have serious concerns about all the cuts to the research labs. That's where innovation happens. I mean, we talked about, I was telling you about the cone of uncertainty before. Well, we've shrunk that cone by half over since Katrina. That's remarkable. Okay, and we want to keep going in that direction. Well, with all the research labs being slashed, people are not working on those kinds of improvements any longer. And there's going to be a huge brain drain from all these research labs. And I could see us remaining static for quite some time. And it could take a while to recover from all this, once we decide this was not the right direction to go in. So it's going to be very interesting. And like I said, I have grave concerns about where we're headed in terms of future innovations in forecasting. So between that and FEMA, I mean, I don't think we're going to be as prepared moving forward.
Barry, you again hit on so many topics where I just want to do follow-up after follow-up. David touched on it, what got you interested in this. I mentioned to you earlier that I did drop in because it's available and looked at your dissertation. And you wrote this in 1994, and I'm just a trial lawyer, but I was damn impressed that in your bibliography, even in 1994, you have 30 citations to Climate Journal, climate research, modeling research, the trends that we are seeing. And your comment about, New Orleans wasn't prepared. We've had people talk to us on this podcast about Lahaina wildfires. We weren't prepared. LA wildfires. We weren't prepared. Asheville. We weren't prepared. Mexico Beach, in the panhandle of Florida. We weren't prepared. And even in Iowa, we flooded and lost our fresh water in 1993 with an intense precipitation event. And I know you're more than just Katrina and Louisiana. Talk to us a little bit about your concerns with the precipitation trends that we're seeing and how you might advise a new Barry working on his PhD in 2025 where his focus should go.
Yeah. That raises an interesting question about never letting a good catastrophe go to waste, right? The bottom line, I mean, it's kind of a callous way of looking at these things. Is, a lot of bad things happen during these events, but there are opportunities to learn and there are opportunities to implement change. Until something happens, we don't usually think it's going to happen. And I think that's why we keep getting caught flat-footed. I mean, Mexico Beach, that oddly enough, I mean, I've done some research on return frequencies of major hurricanes and everything. That area, what we call the Big Bend area of Florida, doesn't get hit that often by major hurricanes. And I think, they went for an extended period where they when I say extended, I mean like many, many, many decades, like 50, 60, 70 years. They hadn't seen a major hurricane, a category 3, 4, or 5 in that Big Bend area of Florida near Mexico Beach. And then all of a sudden you get whacked by one. And of course they're not prepared because they haven't seen anything like that in over 100 years probably. And until it happens, you just don't believe it's going to happen. So, and I think it was, we had the same problem here in New Orleans. We've had some bad storms. Hurricane Betsy in '65 flooded a big chunk of the city, but it didn't have the impact that Katrina had. So that is a big part of it. So it really takes something to happen for us to realize that it can happen, and then we get prepared and we see to it that we're better prepared for the next one when it does happen. So now you're asking about what should researchers be looking at? Well, I had one of my PhD students recently did in terms of how it relates to rainfall. We were looking at whether the intensity of rain is increasing. And that's a kind of a difficult concept to get at, but we had to get down into hourly rainfall data for, many, many sites across the Southeast. And much to my surprise, I guess maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, that we found so many significant results, is that the intensity is increasing. In other words, we're dumping higher amounts of rainfall in shorter periods of time. And another interesting thing is that storms are getting shorter in duration. So rather than getting, 12, 24-hour storms, we're getting more, 2, 3, 4-hour storms with just as much rainfall in that time frame. So that is a really interesting area that's ripe for the picking in terms of, trying to understand how delivery of rainfall is changing. Even if, annual rainfall totals, we're not really seeing lots of change in the annual totals, but the way the rainfall is delivered is changing. And a place like New Orleans, where we have a lot of flash flooding problems because we got to get all the water out of here. But when you put a lot of rain in this city in a very short period of time, the pumps can't keep up. It would, we would be better off with a 12-inch rainfall that is evenly dispersed across the day than to get 6 inches in 2 hours, because we just can't get it out of here, and there's going to be some flooding. So these are the kinds of issues I think moving forward that we probably need to start paying more attention to.
Yeah, along those lines, I'm just curious. You said that you didn't think that this could happen again with some of the modifications that have taken place to the levees, and that you're more prepared this time. I think the rainfall amounts across Louisiana and into Mississippi were anywhere between 10 and 15 inches tops from Katrina. But what would happen with this 25, 28-foot storm surge plus a 52-inch rainfall event like Harvey? Then what happens when you fill in from the backside?
That's that's a lot to unpack. But yes, we have looked at that. And in fact, if we took a Harvey-like storm, in fact, we have a paper recently where we look at that, where we take the footprint of Harvey in the highest rainfall and we put it over New Orleans. And what would that rainfall event look like? The area is about 200 square miles. And if we dropped the maximum amount of rain, it would be close to 50 inches over 5 days. Now, again, if that 50 inches fell evenly, temporally, if it was just spread out evenly and we had a constant rate, in theory, the pumps should be able to keep up with that. The problem is that's not how rainfall falls. And it's going to come in big dumps, and you get, periods where it slacks and then another big dump. And when you get those high rainfall totals in short periods of time and you overwhelm the pumps, it would be pretty ugly. So yeah, if you compounded that with the surge, oh my God, it would be very interesting and scary. I mean, I say interesting, not in a good way. It would be a catastrophe, I think, for the city of New Orleans. And it's certainly within the realm of possibilities that something like that could happen. I don't see any reason why a storm like Harvey, the way it occurred over Texas, why that couldn't occur over here. So yeah, the meteorology could just as well happen here. Now, when you get into the hill country, there are some other things happening there that, create a scenario where you can produce almost near world record rainfall totals over short periods. Fortunately, we don't have that potential here, but we do have the same potential that we had that you'd see in Houston.
Barry, as we close this half hour, and if we need extra time, that's fine. I think as a meteorologist, in your case, the state climatologist, when your home is in the crosshairs, where your hometown is in the crosshairs, take us back just in a few minutes and talk about some of your personal experiences, if you wouldn't mind, with Katrina.
Okay, so in Katrina, I was living in Baton Rouge at the time. Baton Rouge did not bear the brunt of Katrina. We only had minor damage. We were without power for a while, but it really wasn't a big deal there. Now, my mother was still living in, my childhood home in Chalmette, which is in the suburbs of New Orleans. It's just downriver from New Orleans. The house is built on land that's about 3 feet above sea level, and the water there got to about 12 feet above sea level. We had 9 feet of water in the house. And what was mind-boggling about Katrina is not only was our house underwater, but the entire parish. We live in parishes instead of counties. But if you want to think of it, virtually every structure in the parish that I was in had water, up to the first floor practically, and some places even higher. And then everywhere across, 80% of New Orleans was also underwater. And then of course the whole Mississippi coast was wiped out. So, so I had to deal with the aftermath of, going into that house for the first time, seeing, furniture, all toppled over in rooms where it wasn't to begin with. And it was absolutely unbelievable what happens to a house when you fill it up with water. It's some things. It's almost like it defies the laws of physics. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then of course, you throw in the mold, the smells, every refrigerator, what they recommended you do. They didn't, because keep in mind, the storm hits, the place floods out, everybody leaves. They don't let anybody back in for weeks, okay, or maybe even months. And you show up, and everything that was in your refrigerator is still there. Might even have some swamp water in there. They just told everybody to go when they got home. When you start, unloading your house, go in, take duct tape, tape the door shut. Do not even open the thing. Just get it out and put it out on the front lawn, and let the trash folks eventually get around to picking it up. So that was pretty much the MO all across the city. It was not even open up the refrigerators. We had to deal with all that aftermath, and it was pretty wild.
Wow. Dr. Barry Keim, thank you so much for joining us. Former state climatologist for Louisiana. Thank you for joining us today. Can't believe it's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina. And thanks to all of you for watching 3 Degrees, the podcast. For Channing Dutton, David Thorson, I'm Chris Gloninger. Until next time, stay safe.